You are listening to The Bridge Busters, the first Dam Busters and the Race to Save Britain, written by Mark Felton, published by Mandalay Books, and narrated by Mark Felton. Chapter 15. The Flying Colanders. Neither Leroyd nor any of the other men who had attacked the aqueduct saw the results of their suicidal attack. They were long gone, and the survivors were carefully nursing their flak-ravaged Hampdens west, determined to make it to the North Sea and start on the long journey back to Scampton. "Skipper, we've got a problem," crackled Ventral Gunner Rich's voice in Leroyd's headset as he nursed his plane clear of the chaos at the aqueduct. "What's wrong?" Leroyd asked, but he already suspected they had a problem, as the plane was very heavy on the controls. "There's oil coming into my position," Rich said, his voice surprised. "A lot of oil." Glancing at his control panel, which had been damaged by flak shrapnel, Leroyd had trouble making a diagnosis. "Skip," wireless operator Willis chimed in with more bad news. "Your flaps are down. I can see them from here." Leroyd suddenly realized that one of the flak hits had severed his hydraulic fuel lines, leaving him without a hydraulic system vital for trimming the aircraft and for takeoffs and landings. With this in mind, he glanced again at his control panel. "The greens are busted," Leroyd said through the RT. He was referring to the undercarriage indicator lights. They were not functioning. They were supposed to show green when the landing gear was retracted and red when it was being lowered. This meant that when he lowered his gear to land at Scampton, Leroyd would have no way of knowing if the wheels were locked safely into place. He might have to consider a wheels-up belly landing. On the plus side, both engines appeared to be fine, but the damage to his displays meant it was hard for him to monitor his aircraft's vital systems. Someone who was not going anywhere anytime soon was Alan Mulligan, still pinned in the cockpit of his wrecked Hampden in a muddy field outside the village of Mezum on the west bank of the River Ems. He was sitting upright in his seat, bleeding and badly bruised but miraculously still alive after the violence of the crash landing. German soldiers were working to free him from the wreck with crowbars and other tools, but it was soon realized that heavy cutting equipment would be required to prise the Australian pilot loose from his mangled plane. "What about my crew?" Mulligan asked the English-speaking German Air Force officer who was commanding the recovery operation. "One is still alive," the German replied grimly. "Feldwebel, Junge," he said, using the German word for sergeant. "Younger," Mulligan said, correcting the German's pronunciation. Mulligan closed his eyes, shocked and saddened. Younger had been pulled injured from the wreckage and taken to hospital. Unfortunately, the German officer explained, Mulligan's navigator Sergeant Hill and gunner Sergeant Abel had both died during the crash landing. Mulligan had no idea if the raid had been successful, if half his crew, as well as his best friend Ross, had died for something. All he knew was that the sounds of flak in the distance had ceased, meaning that the attack must be over. Hopefully, Matthews and Leroyd had done what Pitcairn Hill, Ross and himself had failed to do, and busted M25 wide open. At that moment, Pitcairn Hill, Matthews and Leroyd were ploughing on towards the coast and the first stage of the journey back across the North Sea. Joe Collier and the diversion force were also headed the same way. Every aircraft had taken damage to one degree or another, but the three surviving main attack force aircraft and Collier's plane were in the worst condition. Aboard Collier's Hampden, now that they were out of immediate danger, Sergeant Johnson, the wireless operator, crawled forward to render first aid to navigator Sergeant Stubbings, who had a piece of shrapnel lodged painfully in one of his buttocks. In spite of the considerable pain and blood loss, Stubbings had remained at his post, feeding vital navigational information to Collier. Johnson patched up his mate as best he could in the Hampden's cramped confines, Stubbings giving him a weak smile of gratitude. "No more ops for you for a while, old son," Johnson shouted above the racket of howling wind through broken perspex panels and jagged holes in the aircraft's skin and the drone of the one good engine. Aboard Jamie Pitcairn Hill's plane, wireless operator George Roscoe was having his head wounds checked by air gunner Bale. Apart from a headache and dried blood down one side of his face, Sergeant Roscoe appeared to be fine, the wounds largely superficial. His luck had been good. He continued to perform his duties without complaint. Pitcairn Hill nursed his damaged bomber to higher altitude. He had no idea what had become of the rest of his flight. They had been first through the maelstrom of exploding flak and had barely managed to remain airborne. With the Germans fully alerted by Pitcairn Hill's attack, what chance have the other planes had? Pitcairn Hill feared that some or all would have fallen to the defences. At the very least, the rest of the flight would be little more than flying colanders by now, riddled from end to end by German shot and shell. He glanced apprehensively at his own control panel, paying particular attention to his engines. He jiggled the throttles forward gently, careful not to overexert the engines, which may have been damaged and could yet malfunction. "Keep your eyes skinned for night fighters, chaps," he said into the RT. Flak was not the only worry. German twin-engined Messerschmitt Bf 110s prowled along the Dutch coast like sharks, hoping to pick off lone British intruders. The raid could have undoubtedly triggered a full response from the local Luftwaffe command, and they knew that at least one intruder had survived the raid and was heading home right through their hunting range. Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 was a night fighter squadron based at Dehlen. Luckily for Pitcairn Hill and the other crews returning from the M25 raid, at this stage the Bf 110s were not fitted with interception radars to aid the pilots with finding British bombers. Instead, they relied on visual identification, and in the early hours of the 13th of August was well lit by a half moon. If one of the German night fighters encountered a lone Hamden, a terminal outcome would have been almost a certainty, as the German aircraft's nose was fitted with 4 machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. A couple of control bursts would have easily shredded a Hamden and sent it spiralling down into the sea in flames. The dread fear of night fighters would never be far from the minds of any of the crews nursing their battle-wrecked bombers back to England that night. Hugh Matthews moved his stiff body inside his cockpit, his back aching from trying to hold the damaged bomber on course. Like Pitcairn Hill, Leroyd and Collier, he watched his dials and gauges with a mixture of apprehension and disbelief. The old crate was still airborne, though one of its engines had been reduced to junk. He glanced at it now, the propeller completely stopped, bits of cowling peeled back or missing. The other engine was doing all the work, hardly an ideal situation. But the Hamden could be flown on one engine, if necessary, and it would still be several hours before Matthews could land. Everything came down to that one remaining Bristol motor. "Crossing the coast, Skip," Navigator Sergeant Fennell's voice breaking Matthews' train of thought. "Okay, Navigator," Matthews replied, glancing down out of the shattered cockpit glass. Thousands of feet below, the moonlight picked out the darker coast against the shimmering dark grey of the sea. There was no turning back now. If their one remaining good engine overheated and packed up, there were only 2 options open to the crew. Matthews could order them to bail out, or he could glide down and attempt to ditch in the sea. The first option meant probable death, either from drowning as the crewmen attempted to disentangle themselves from their parachute harnesses and inflate their Mae West life jackets. They would be split up and drift off alone on the dark ocean, tiny specks in water that was still bone-chillingly cold in summer. The other option, with ditching, was risky. Depending on the sea state, the aircraft might pancake into the water and everyone take to the life raft, or it might well strike a swell and flip over and break up, killing or injuring everyone aboard. And to add to Matthews' worries, there was no central air-sea rescue system in place at this time of the war. It was up to the squadrons themselves to locate downed aircrew and direct Royal Navy rescue craft to them. It was a hopeless task. Some crews from 49 and 83 squadrons who had had to ditch had ended up spending days adrift, suffering from seasickness, exposure, hypothermia, and dehydration before they had been spotted by accident by ships and rescued, and there was no guarantee that the rescue vessel would be friendly. Matthew's eyes flicked back to the gauges, giving readings for his good engine. He prayed for all their sakes that it would not fail them now. Aboard Leroyd's aircraft, a decision was reached long before they saw the English coast. Landing the plane in the dark was out of the question. It was simply too much of a risk. With his hydraulics shot to pieces, flaps inoperative, and landing gear indicators gone, trying to land at Scampton would probably end in disaster. Leroyd knew that he needed daylight to be able to judge distances properly and make his approach, which would inevitably end with a very heavy landing. He knew that he would have to make a belly landing with his undercarriage indicators out of action. Leroyd was faced with the stark reality that his aircraft was critically damaged, and there was a real chance that after coming through the worst raid of their career, they might all die landing at their home base. The decision was made that once they arrived over Scampton, Leroyd would put the aircraft into a holding pattern until dawn broke. It meant adding more time to the sortie. The other members of the crew said nothing. They all had supreme faith in Babe to bring them home in one piece. "They're returning, sir," Wing Commander John Sisson said over the phone to the station commander at Scampton, Group Captain Walmsley. "I'll be right over," Walmsley replied. He left his office hurriedly, pulling on his cap. Soon a small reception committee had congregated, all waiting for the first planes to return to the base. The first Hampden, part of the diversion force, touched down at 1:30 a.m. Flying Officer Riley's P-1347 had taken some flak damage. From 2 o'clock onwards they started arriving more regularly. Flying Officer Drake's in L4195 landed at 2:30, followed by Sergeants Sowell and Haskell, then Squadron Leader Lowe, who had failed to find the target and had bombed Texel Island instead. All these aircraft were from the diversion flight. The crews who had been near the canal all reported heavy concentrations of flak, and all had taken numerous hits. What had become of the attack flight, nobody knew for certain. The tension was broken by the appearance of Pitcairn Hill's P-4402 just before 3 a.m. It lumbered in over the field and made a heavy landing. As it taxied to a halt, the observers on the ground were horrified by the state of Pitcairn Hill's plane. It looked as though someone had taken a giant shotgun to it, such were the number of holes and gashes in the fuselage and wings. Pitcairn Hill clambered groggily from the cockpit, dragging off his flying helmet and goggles. His eyes were ringed with exhaustion. They had a wild, shocked look. The other crewmen looked shell-shocked as well, very relieved to be back home. Wearily, they departed for an immediate debriefing with Squadron Leader Frost. Next to land was Hugh Matthews, who touched down at 3:10 a.m. He taxied to a halt and shut off his one good engine. For a few seconds he sat in the cockpit staring into space, in shock, and then a ground crewman wrenched back his shattered canopy and started to unbuckle his harness. "Rossi bought it," Matthews said in a dull, exhausted voice to Frost during his debriefing a few minutes later, shaking his head and pulling nervously on a cigarette. "He blew up. Just blew up." "What about Mulligan?" Frost asked, horrified. "The last I saw, one of his engines was on fire," Matthews replied. "I don't think he made it." Frost was growing concerned as each aircrew made their reports. After Joe Collier had touched down, he quickly corroborated Matthews' report about the fate of Ellis Ross and P-4410. He had seen Ross's plane on fire, he told Frost, and it had passed close to his own machine before striking the ground and exploding. Questioning the surviving attack crews about whether any of them had managed to land an M-bomb in the aqueduct produced little information. Pitcairn Hill said that his crew had not been able to see where the bomb landed due to the flak and searchlights. Ross and Mulligan were both shot down some distance from M25, but Matthews was pretty sure he'd hit close to the aqueduct, though again couldn't be sure because of the blizzard of flak and blinding searchlights. It was beginning to look as though the whole operation had failed at a dreadful cost in human lives and aircraft. There remained only Babe Leroyd unaccounted for. Soon after, a message arrived. Leroyd's plane had been sighted, and a wireless message received explaining that due to severe damage, Leroyd would not land until after dawn. Aboard Leroyd's Hampden, the doughty pilot took the plane on several lazy loops out over the Lincolnshire countryside while the crew all waited for the first tendrils of light to appear on the eastern horizon. Leroyd monitored his engines while the crew busied themselves with minor tasks to pass the time before the landing. Everyone knew that this landing was going to be a dicey affair, requiring every ounce of flying skill that the exhausted pilot possessed. "There, Skip, I see it!" John Lewis cried out from the aircraft's nose. Leroyd glanced east, and it was unmistakable, a thin line of light along the horizon. Dawn had finally arrived. As he held the plane in its holding pattern, Leroyd watched as the light grew stronger until the burning ball of the sun rose majestically into a clear summer's sky. "Right, chaps," Leroyd said. "We're going in." Leroyd swung the plane onto a bearing towards Scampton, and a few minutes later they were over the grass airfield, its hangars and buildings all wonderfully familiar in the early morning light. He started to bleed off the altitude and ease back on his throttles, trying to slow the aircraft, but she was still coming in faster than he would have liked. The wheels remained locked firmly in their wells. "Get ready," Leroyd said curtly, and everyone braced themselves as the grass runway started to come up very fast towards them. Those on the ground watched with dread fascination as the Hampden lined up for its final approach, the wings jiggling as Leroyd touched the controls, making fine adjustments. Then, just above the ground, Leroyd immediately throttled down and feathered the propellers, trying to slow the aircraft without the benefit of his broken flaps, the weight of the plane coming to rest on the grass with a rumble. He stiffened, expecting at any moment that the plane would flip or break up, but the plane rattled and bumped and slewed to a messy halt, gouging up the grass for hundreds of yards behind. Then there was a heavy silence, broken only by the sounds of the engines ticking as they cooled. Leroyd waited for the ground crews who were rushing towards his plane aboard trucks. He glanced at his shattered control panel. Among the broken and missing instruments, the clock remained strangely functional. It read 4:52 a.m. The raid was finally over. Leroyd had been the last man to attack the aqueduct and the last man back. And what he couldn't know yet was that he had succeeded where all the others, over so many different raids, had failed. Babe Leroyd's M-bomb had detonated precisely 10 minutes after it had been laid into aqueduct M25, with devastating results. Exploding like a depth charge, a tall plume of white water was thrown high into the air, and the sonic pressure wave dislodged bricks and cracked the wall's concrete skin. Then, little jets of water shot through microscopic holes that quickly widened until, with a groan, a huge section of the aqueduct cracked further, bulged, and then finally gave way and collapsed. Thousands of tons of water a second started to pour through the breach, an uncontrollable torrent that washed away more of the aqueduct's brick wall and arches until almost the entire right side was destroyed, flooding the surrounding countryside and quickly emptying a section of canal. Until the Germans could close emergency gates, the area surrounding M25 was deluged and turned into a swamp. M25 was closed to all traffic. She was completely out of action and would be for some time to come. Epilogue. "There's a telephone call for you, sir," a polite voice murmured at Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham's elbow. It was the 19th of August, 1940. Since the raid on M25, Babe Leroyd had been taken off flying operations and assigned as personal assistant to Brooke Popham. In this capacity, he had been having drinks in the officers' mess at RAF Marham in Cambridgeshire when a call had come through. "Will you excuse me?" Brooke Popham said politely before leaving the room. A few moments later he returned. "It's for you, Leroyd." "Me, sir?" Leroyd replied, nonplussed. Brooke Popham nodded, and Leroyd made his apologies and left the room, stepping into an anteroom where a black telephone was fastened to the wall. The receiver lay on a tray beside the phone. Leroyd picked it up. "Flight Lieutenant Leroyd," he announced. "Ah, Leroyd, this is Harris," replied a rather gruff voice on the other end. For a second, Leroyd was confused. "Who?" he asked, slightly annoyed. "Air Vice Marshal Harris," said the voice at the other end. Leroyd stiffened. "Now look here, Leroyd," continued the older man. "I have some splendid news. You've been awarded the VC for that canal business." Leroyd was momentarily stunned. Then he grew annoyed. "Don't be ridiculous," he snapped back. "It's a damn silly prank." "Now look here," started the voice, but Leroyd was calmed by the sudden appearance of Brooke Popham. He looked concerned. "It is Air Vice Marshal Harris, Leroyd," Brooke Popham interjected in an urgent voice. Leroyd was stunned and speechless. "You there, young man?" Harris's voice crackled down the line. Leroyd raised the receiver once more to his ear. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir." "Never mind about all that," Harris cut in. "Did you hear what I said? You've been awarded the VC. Damn good show." Leroyd was numb. It seemed like a dream. Brooke Popham suggested that he take some time, and Leroyd drove into Cambridge and found a pub. Sitting at the bar with a pint of beer, he dropped into conversation with an older man doing the same. When Leroyd told him that he had just been awarded the Victoria Cross, the man just stared at him as if the young pilot was mad and abruptly left. The next day, 20th of August, the award of the Victoria Cross to Flight Lieutenant Roderick Leroyd was officially announced in the London Gazette. Leroyd travelled up to Buckingham Palace on the 9th of September and was personally invested with Britain's highest award for gallantry by King George VI. By the time that the King was pinning a VC to Leroyd's broad chest, the Battle of Britain was in full swing. Leroyd and the M25 raiders had landed back at Scampton in the early hours of the 13th of August. Later that same day, Goering had launched Adler Angriff, or Eagle Day, the first vast aerial assault on Britain by the Luftwaffe. Hitler was still running to an invasion timetable that would see the German army cross the Channel on the 15th of September. But like the cracks that appeared in M25 following Leroyd's successful bombing of the aqueduct, cracks that had quickly caused the structure's catastrophic failure, the damage Leroyd had caused soon had a direct bearing on Hitler's carefully conceived timetable. While Fighter Command tangled daily with swarms of German bombers and fighters over the southern counties, 10 precious days were lost, while Organisation Todt, Hitler's engineering unit, made desperately fast repairs to M25 so that the supply of barges and materials to the invasion ports could resume its normal flow. But the damage had been done. For 10 vital days, M25 was out of commission, and the knock-on effects were enormous. The Luftwaffe did not manage to destroy Fighter Command, which, though on the ropes, nonetheless fought back with a ferocity and tenacity that surprised and shocked the Germans, who thought that Britain was a spent force. At the same time, the unsung heroes of Bomber Command nightly struck the concentrations of barges in the Channel ports, nibbling away at the German build-up and causing yet more delays and disruption. Hitler grew impatient and anxious. If the 15th of September invasion date was missed, the Navy informed him that the next available weather window was the 22nd to the 26th of September. The 15th of September date passed without the expected German onslaught happening. The delays occasioned by the destruction of M25 had thrown the delicate timetable into disarray. Instead, this day has become known as Battle of Britain Day, the day when RAF Fighter Command defeated Goering's last massive concerted effort to rub out aerial resistance. On the 17th of September, Hitler held a meeting with Goering and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander in the West, during which he became convinced that an invasion of England was no longer viable. Control of the skies was still lacking as RAF Fighter Command stubbornly refused to collapse. Later that day, Hitler ordered Operation Sea Lion postponed. His decision was affected not only by the sterling efforts of Fighter Command Spitfires and Hurricanes, but by the destruction of M25 and the Battle of the Barges, both of which had seriously impeded the movement of invasion equipment to the Channel coast and ruined his timetable. Bomber Command had struck blows as significant and damaging as those delivered by the fighters, but without the credit and public thanks that was their due. Even the award of a VC to Leroyd was barely acknowledged by the press. It was only because of men like Leroyd and the other boys of 5 Group that valuable barges were sunk and damaged, and most importantly, aqueduct M25, needed to launch Hitler's invasion, was destroyed. The award of a Victoria Cross is indication enough of the importance the government placed on M25 and its destruction during Britain's darkest hour. Hitler would permanently give up his plans to invade Britain soon after. On the 12th of October 1940, he issued a directive sending the forces amassed for the invasion of England to other fronts. He would make a decision in the spring as to whether Sea Lion would be reactivated. That decision was soon superseded by a new invasion, codenamed Barbarossa. Hitler's eyes had turned instead to an attack on the Soviet Union. Britain was saved. What became of the M25 heroes? Victor Bennett. Wing Commander Bennett continued with a successful RAF career following his sterling work on the aqueduct's attacks. Leaving plans, he commanded No. 10 Squadron, then received the Distinguished Flying Cross in October 1941, shortly after his promotion to Group Captain in Middle East Command. He later served in a high staff position in the Mediterranean Allied Coastal Air Force. Awarded a mention in dispatches in June 1945, Bennett left the RAF in October 1947 with the rank of Air Commodore. Victor Bennett died in May 1973, aged 70. Joe Collier. It is believed that Collier was also recommended for a Victoria Cross for his part in the raid on M25, but that it was decided by the top brass that only one would be awarded for the entire operation. Instead, Collier received the DFC because of his actions on the night of the 12th to 13th of August 1940, for which he was mentioned in dispatches, and for another action shortly after, when he made a hazardous, low-level attack on an oil refinery at Bordeaux. Collier was awarded a bar to his DFC for an attack he made on the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst, and in 1942 commanded No. 97 Squadron flying Lancasters, receiving the Distinguished Service Order for exemplary conduct. During the war, Joe Collier completed 63 operational sorties over enemy territory. In 1943, Collier was shifted to the Air Ministry's planning staff, working closely with his old friend from 83 Squadron days, Guy Gibson, in the planning of Operation Chastise, the famous Dambusters raid. By late 1945, Collier was station commander at RAF Kankasankuri in Sri Lanka, and then at Iwakuni in Japan. Transferred back to Britain in 1947, he was a member of the directing staff of the RAF Staff College at Bracknell, then had a staff appointment at the Air Navigating School, followed by Headquarters Bomber Command and NATO in Norway. Collier retired from the RAF in 1959 and became a land agent in Hampshire. After retiring for a second time, aged 65, he devoted much of his time to voluntary work for Dr. Barnardo's children's homes. Group Captain John Collier died in 2000, aged 83. Guy Gibson. Returning from leave soon after the successful raid on M25, Gibson was promoted to Flight Lieutenant on the 3rd of September 1940. He made his last sortie with 83 Squadron on the 23rd, raiding Berlin. After a short period as a flying instructor, Gibson was given command of A Flight, No. 29 Squadron, a night fighter unit equipped with the Bristol Beaufighter 1. His first confirmed kill, a Heinkel HE-111 bomber, was recorded on the 14th of March 1941. Promoted to acting squadron leader at the end of June 1941, he shot down 2 more German bombers and was awarded a bar to his DFC. Following a second stint as an instructor, Gibson was called to an interview with Bomber Harris, now commanding Bomber Command, and promoted to acting wing commander and told to take over No. 106 Squadron at RAF Coningsby. No. 106 was equipped with the problematic Manchester bomber, but later transferred to the Lancaster. Gibson showed consistent aggression, always leading from the front and making attacks on hard-to-reach targets. He participated in raids on Germany, France and Italy and was awarded the DSO. On one raid, he took along famous BBC war correspondent Richard Dimbleby to Berlin, an event later made into a radio programme. After a total of 172 sorties since September 1939, Harris awarded Gibson a bar to his DSO. Gibson was specially selected to command a special squadron, number 617, tasked with destroying the vital Ruhr dams. Based back at RAF Scampton, Gibson carefully selected and trained the crews for Operation Chastise. The squadron practiced relentlessly on reservoirs and lakes across Britain, including at Ibrook, Derwent and Abberton near Colchester, until Gibson was satisfied that the top-secret bouncing bomb could be delivered on target. The Dambusters raid, the night of the 16th to 17th of May 1943, was very successful. 2 dams were breached and a third damaged, with catastrophic flooding caused in the Ruhr Valley. On the 22nd of June, Gibson received the Victoria Cross at Buckingham Palace. Accompanying Prime Minister Churchill's party to the Quebec Conference, Gibson made a promotional tour of Canada and the United States, being invested with the Legion of Merit in Washington, D.C. Once back in Britain, he was made a staff officer, though he was able to fly on active operations on occasion, the government not keen to risk the life of Britain's most decorated and famous serviceman. However, on the 19th of September 1944, Gibson, keen to get back into action, volunteered to fly a Pathfinder mission on a raid to Bremen. His Mosquito B-20 was shot down and crashed at Steenbergen in Holland. Gibson and his navigator were both killed. Guy Gibson was 26 years old. Arthur Bomber Harris. Harris was reputedly less than pleased at having to launch the raid against M25. He considered that the raid was almost an act of madness rather than an act of war. He felt, probably justifiably, that he was asking his crews to carry out suicide missions. Any operation which deserves the VC is in the nature of things unfit to be repeated at frequent intervals, he wrote in his memoir. The experience of the raid against M25 in 1940 profoundly influenced his opposition to Guy Gibson's Dambusters raid in 1943, though he was overruled due to the importance of the targets. In June 1941, Harris was promoted to acting Air Marshal and in February 1942 took over bomber command from Portal. Made a Knight of the Order of the Bath in June, he soon formulated his controversial area bombing strategy that saw massive raids by up to 1,000 bombers on German cities, including Cologne, Hamburg and Berlin. Regarding this policy, Harris famously commented about the Germans, "They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." On the 1st of January 1944, the Soviet Union awarded Harris the Order of Suvorov First Class, indicating how much Stalin appreciated Bomber Command's efforts, one point of which was the tying down of 10,000 dreaded German 88mm anti-aircraft guns that could have been deployed instead against Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front. In the lead-up to D-Day, Harris redeployed Bomber Command in attacks to disrupt the French railway network and hinder German troop deployments. After D-Day, he resumed his area bombing campaign against Germany, the Americans awarding him the Legion of Merit in January 1945. On the 13th of February 1945, Harris ordered one of the most controversial air attacks of the war, the flattening of Dresden. But Harris firmly believed that his tactics were shortening the war and saving the lives of Allied soldiers. In June, he was made a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath and then promoted to Marshal of the Royal Air Force. He was further honoured by the United States, receiving the Distinguished Service Medal. After the war, Bomber Command's huge sacrifices were largely sidelined, as Harris's area bombing campaign continued to divide public opinion. Harris moved to South Africa, returning to live at Goring-on-Thames in England in 1953. The same year, Prime Minister Churchill had Harris created a baronet. Arthur Bomber Harris died in April 1984, just shy of his 92nd birthday. In 1992, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, unveiled a statue of him outside the RAF Church, St Clement Danes in London. Roderick Babe Learoyd. Learoyd soon returned to active service, serving with number 44 Squadron, the first unit to be equipped with the Lancaster until the end of the war. Promoted to squadron leader in 1942, Leroyd stayed in the RAF Reserve until 1958, reaching the rank of wing commander. After the war, he worked as a VIP pilot and later as a sales manager in the motor industry. Babe Leroyd died at Rustington in West Sussex in January 1996, aged 82. His Victoria Cross is today displayed at the Imperial War Museum in London. Alan Mulligan. It took the Germans 4 hours to cut Mulligan from the wreckage of his Hampden beside the River Ems. After a brief period in hospital, Mulligan was sent to Stalag Luft 1, an Air Force prisoner of war camp at Barth in Germany, and was later at the famous Stalag Luft 3 during the Great Escape. Whilst a prisoner, he learned that he had been awarded the Bar to his Distinguished Flying Cross for his gallant attack on M25. Mulligan was liberated in May 1945 and returned to Australia. He transferred as a flight lieutenant to the Royal Australian Air Force, leaving the services in June 1946. In March 1947, in a ceremony in Sydney hosted by the Governor-General of Australia, Mulligan received the bar to his DFC that he had been awarded whilst a POW, and was later mentioned in dispatches. The 2 members of Mulligan's crew that died, Sergeants Abel and Hill, were buried by the Germans in the Reichswald War Cemetery, where they lie still. Jamie Pitcairn Hill. For the audacious raid on Aqueduct M25, Pitcairn Hill received the Distinguished Service Order, then second only to the Victoria Cross for his gallant leadership. A couple of weeks after the raid, he survived a ditching in the North Sea when his Hampden ran out of fuel coming back from a raid on Berlin, but he managed to crash land the bomber next to a Grimsby fishing trawler, and he and his crew were swiftly rescued. Sadly, squadron leader Pitcairn Hill was killed on the 18th of September 1940 when his Hampden was shot down by German flak over the Seine estuary. His body and those of 2 of his crew were washed ashore and were buried at Luxembourg, overlooking what would become Sword Beach on D-Day in June 1944. He was 24 years old. L.S. Ross. The remains of Flying Officer Ross, Sergeant Dewhurst, Sergeant Sayer and leading aircraftman Buckley were recovered from the wreckage of their Hampden by the Germans and buried beside the Dortmund-Ems Canal. Tragically, these graves were later completely obliterated during large-scale British bombing efforts against the canal during the last months of the war. Today, these men are remembered on the Runnymede Memorial. Some of the others. Sergeant George Roscoe, Pitcairn Hill's navigator on the raid, was hospitalised at RAF Raunceby until the 4th of September 1940, recovering from the shrapnel wounds to his head. He recalled that he was very glad that he had been in the first plane to attack M25, as at least there had been some element of surprise. Roscoe only flew 1 more operational sortie before being permanently grounded due to an ear problem. Awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal in September 1940 for his service in 26 sorties, he remained in the RAF until 1969. Leading aircraftman Robert Allwood of Pilot Officer Matthews' crew and leading aircraftman William Rich, Leroyd's ventral gunner, were both awarded immediate Distinguished Flying Medals for their roles in the M25 raid. They were the first men of that rank to be so awarded during World War II. Sergeant Charles Fennell, Matthews' navigator bomb-aimer, was awarded the DFM in November 1940, partly for the M25 raid. In total, Fennell carried out 38 combat sorties with No. 49 Squadron. In 1943, he was commissioned as a flight lieutenant, served in Rhodesia in 1953 and retired from the RAF in 1957. He died in Gloucester in 1979, aged 67. Sergeant Younger, an air gunner aboard Alan Mulligan's plane that crash-landed near the Dortmund-Ems Canal, was made a prisoner of war. He was a prisoner at Stalag Luft 1 near Barth, Germany, and Stalag Luft 6 at Heidekrug in Lithuania. In May 1945, he was liberated from Stalag 357 at Fallingbostel in Germany. You have been listening to The Bridge Busters, The First Dam Busters and The Race to Save Britain, written by Mark Felton, published by Mandalay Books and narrated by Mark Felton. If you'd like to relive the action in your own time, you can purchase a paperback or Kindle copy of The Bridgebusters at Amazon.com and Amazon.co.uk. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.